Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose, the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course, and in truth there was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigour, and Mrs. Belinda sweetened up the apple sauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner of the table, and the two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came or be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, and Mrs. Cratchit looking slowly all along, the carving knife prepared to plunge it into the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all round the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife, and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavour, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the apple sauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last, yet every one had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Mrs. Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should be done enough. Suppose it should break in, turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall in the backyard and stolen it whilst they were merry with a goose, a supposition of which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Then a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper, a smell like a washing day. There was the cloth, a smell like an eating house, and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next door to that. It was the pudding. In half a minute Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and belighted with Christmas holly stuck into the top. "Oh, a wonderful pudding," Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind. She would confess she had had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up, the compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew around the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half of one, and Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as the golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, whilst the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us." With which all the family echoed, "God bless us, every one." And Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand of his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney's corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit, say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear the words quoted by the spirit, his words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you are in your heart, not adamant, forbear. The wicked can't until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live and what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. O God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon. I'd hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure," she said, "on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink his health for your sake and for the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit, "not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings, which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. To mention his name was to cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge, the baleful being done with him. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favour when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told him what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest, tomorrow being a holiday she passed at home, and how she had seen a countess and a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have even seen his head if you had been there. And at this time the chestnuts in the jug went round and round, and by they had a song about a lost child travelling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family, They were not well dressed, their shoes were far from being waterproof, their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and content with the time at which they faded, and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting. Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. By this time it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the Spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in kitchens and parlours and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed preparations for a cosy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains ready to be drawn or shut out the cold and darkness. All of the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and to be the first to greet them. Here again were shadows on the window blind of guests assembling, and there were a group of handsome girls all hooded and fur-booted, and all chattering at once, tripping lightly off to some near neighbour's house, where woe upon the single man who saw him enter awful witches. Well, they knew it in a glow. But if you had judged from the numbers of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was at home to give them welcome when they got there. Instead of every house expecting company and piling up its fires, half chimney high, and blessing on it how the ghost exalted, how it bared its breath of a breast, and opened its capacious palm, and floated on, outpouring with generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on everything within its reach. The very lamplighter who ran on before, dotting the dusky streets with specks of light, and who was dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as a spirit passed through the little kenned the lamplighter that he had any company but Christmas. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, as though it were a burial place of giants, and water spread itself wheresoever it listed, or would have done so, but for the frost that held it prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse rank grass. Down in the west of the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant, like a sullen eye, frowning lower and lower, lower yet, and was lost in the thick gloom of darkness, darkest night. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labour in the bowels of the earth," returned the Spirit. "But they know me. See." A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced towards it. Passing through the walls of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire, an old man and woman with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so surely as they stopped, his vigour sank again. The Spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his rope, and pass on above no more, speed whither, not sea to sea. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, a frightful range of rocks behind them, and in his ears were deafened by the thundering of the water as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn, and fiercely tried to undermine the earth. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from there, on which the waters chafed and dashed the wild year through, there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to the base, and storm birds born of the wind. One might suppose the seaweed of the water rose and fell about it like waves they skimmed. but even here 2 men who watched. The light had made a fire, and through the loophole in the thick stone wall shed out a ray of the brightness into the awful sea, joining their horny hands over the rough table at which they sat. They wished each other a Merry Christmas in their can of grog. And one of them, the elder too, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as the figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on above the black and heaving sea, on and on, until, being far away, he told Scrooge from any shore they lighted on the ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel and looked out of the bow. The officers who had the watch, dark, ghostly figures in their several stations, but every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it, and every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had a kinder word for another on that day than any other day of the year, and had shared to some extent in the festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, whilst listening to the moaning of the wind, and thinking what solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over the unknown abyss, whose depths were secret and profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear the hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognise it as his own nephew, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at the same nephew with approving affability. "Ha ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha ha! If you should happen, by any unlikely chance, to know a man more blessed in his laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is, I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance." It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is infection and disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter, and as good humour. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece, by marriage, laughed as heartily as he, and they assembled, friends being not a bit behindhand, roared out lustily, "Ha ha, ha ha, ha ha!" "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live," cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. "Bless those women, they never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest." She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprising look, capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether she was what you would have called provoking, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. "He's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his own offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him." "I'm sure he's very rich, Fred," hinted Scrooge's niece. "At least you always tell me so." "What of that, my dear?" to Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking, ha ha, that he is ever going to benefit us with it." "I have no patience with him," observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew. "I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself. Always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come to dine with us. What's the consequence? He won't lose much of a dinner. Indeed. If I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece, everybody else says the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges because they had just had dinner, and with the dessert upon the table, were clustered round the fire by lamplight. Well, I'm very glad to hear it, said Scrooge's nephew, because I have great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper had clearly not got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject, whereas Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with roses, blushed. Do go on, Fred, said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. He never finishes what he begins to say. He's such a ridiculous fellow. Scrooge's nephew revelled in another laugh, as it was impossible to keep the infection off. Although the plump sister tried hard to do with aromatic vinegar, his example was unanimously followed. I was only going to say, said Scrooge's nephew, that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. And I'm sure he loses pleasant companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either of his own mouldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean, to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it puts him in a vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something, and I think I shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured, and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed, at any rate. He encouraged them in their moments, and passed the bottle joyously. After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family. They knew what they were about when they sung glee or catch. I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one, and never swell on the large veins on his forehead, or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played other tunes, a simple little air. I mean, nothing you might learn to whistle in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When the strain of music sounded, all the things the ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits, for it's good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop. There was first a game of blind man's bluff. Of course there was. And no, I no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that he was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas presents knew it. The way he went after that plump sister in a lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature, knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping against the piano, smothering himself amongst the curtains. Wherever she went, there went he. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, as some of them did, on purpose, he would have made a feint of endeavour to seize you, and would have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have slided off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried that it wasn't fair, and it really was not. But when at last he caught her, when in spite of her silken rustlings and her rapid flutterings past him, he got her into the corner, whence there was no escape, and then his conduct was the most extreme. For his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was necessary to touch her headdress, and further to assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger and a certain chain about her neck. It was vile, monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it. When another blind man being in office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind man's buff party. He was a male, comfortable, but was made comfortable with a large chair and a footstool, and in a snug corner where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. But she joined in the forfeits, and loved her love to her admiration, with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise at the game of how, when, and where, she was very great, and the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as Topper would have told you. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting in the interest he had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears. He sometimes came out with his guess quite loud, and very often guessed quite right too, for the sharpest needle, and best Whitechapel warranted not to cut in the eye, was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favour, that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guest departed. But this the spirit said could not be done. "Here's a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what, with the only answering to the questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning, to which he was exposed, elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal rather than a disagreeable animal and a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in the market, and was not a horse, nor an ass, nor a cow, nor a bull, nor a tiger, nor a dog, nor a pig, nor a cat, nor a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last, the plump sister, falling into a chair, cried out, "I found out! I know what it is, Fred." "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, although some object, that to reply, "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, insomuch as the answer was in the negative, was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they had ever had any tendency that way. "He's given us plenty of merriment, I'm sure," said Fred, "and that would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here's a glass of mulled wine ready at our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge." "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried, "a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to the old man wherever he is," said Scrooge's nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but may he have it, nevertheless, Uncle Scrooge." Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return, and thanked them in the inaudible speech, if the ghost had given them time, but the whole seemed passed off in the breath of the last word spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands they were close at home. By struggling men they were patient, and in their greater hope by poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain men in a little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out, and left his blessings and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holiday appeared to be condensed into the space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left the children's 12th night party, when, looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that his hair was grey. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Mr. Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight!" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight! Hark, the time is drawing near." The chimes were ringing, 11:15 at the moment. "Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirt. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." From the foldings of his robe it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightfulness, hideous, miserable, and they knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. "Oh, man, look here, look down here," exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too, in their humility. Grateful youth should have filled their features out, and touched them with its fresh tints. A stale, shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacingly. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade. Through all the mysteries of wonderful creation, has monsters half so horrible and dread? Scrooge started back, appalled, having them shown to him in this way. He tried to say that they were fine children, but these words choked themselves rather than parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them, "and they are clinging to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree, but most of all, beware this boy. For on his brow I see the written, which is doom, unless the writing be erased, denied," cried the spirit, stretching out his hand towards the city. "Slander those who tell ye, admit it for your factious purposes, and make it worse, and bide the end." "Have they no refuge or resource?" cried Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. At the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes beheld the solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. Here endeth the 3rd chapter.